Hello and welcome to video number 6 in the Python tutorial series. My name is Steve and today we'll be looking at the topic of advanced string formatting. And this should be a fairly quick and easy lesson, and it's centered around a concept that we've already been doing, and that's string concatenation, or putting together strings so that we can display information back to the user. Now moving forward with the 7th lesson and so forth, we'll be looking at some conditionals and things that will allow us to take the user information and make our program react differently based on what the user wants to do. But this should be the last real simple formatting basics lesson. We'll start getting into more advanced programs in the next lesson. But this is a topic that I think is very important to master. It centers around displaying readable information quickly to the users so that they can get feedback from the program, they can know what's going on. And I think that using the advanced string formatting techniques that I'm going to show you here in a little bit are going to make your code a little bit easier to read and understand. So we're going to go ahead and get started here with advanced string formatting. Okay, so we're going to be using Python formatting codes using the %, and there's 3 that we're going to be looking at: %s, %d, and %f, as in Frank. There are some others, but we don't necessarily need to get into those right now. So let's go over here to the Python shell and take a look. We're going to set a variable name, and I'm going to have name equal the string of Steve. And so now when I type in name, I can see the name variable points to a value of Steve. And in the past, we've done statements like print the string my first name is, and then we've used the plus symbol to concatenate the variable name. And we've gotten a sentence, my first name is Steve. And that's pretty common, but using the formatting codes, we can make this what I think it's a little bit simpler. If I were to do a print statement and say my first name is, and put in a %s, that %s is a formatting code that lets Python know that somewhere, that after this string is ended, we're going to give it a value to replace that %s in the string. And the way I'm going to let it know that I'm doing that is by putting a % after I close the string out, and then let it know what variable I want to show up in that %s placeholder. So your statement looks like print, my first name is %s. We use the % and the variable name, and I get the exact same output. My first name is Steve. The difference is, instead of concatenating name directly where I want it, I'm putting placeholders in my sentences and listing the variables at a later date. Now, one of the reasons I find this to be a little bit easier is one of the problems with that sentence is it doesn't have any punctuation. Using the old method, I would put my first name is, and then I would have to remember to end it with a space. I would have to use the plus concatenator, add name, and then I would have to add my punctuation on the end. And to me, this looks a little bit clunky. It's not that hard to understand, but if I use the formatting method and write my first name is %s, just put a period at the end of it, and then type my %, let it know that I want name to replace that %s. Again, I'm going to get the exact same output, but the difference is this period right here can just appear naturally in the string. So I'm only having to have one string here, where this one I'm going to have 2 strings, a variable in between, and I'm adding them together. So for me, I think it makes the code look a little bit cleaner. Now I might have something like location, and I am located in Arizona, so I'm going to have the string Arizona right there. And if I wanted to use the old method to print both my name and my location, I would say print My first name is, remember my space, concatenate name on there, and I live in, and then I'm going to concatenate location, and then I'm going to add my period at the end of the sentence, and that creates a readable sentence. My first name is Steve, and I live in Arizona. But again, there's a lot going on in this statement. I find it a lot easier to do something such as print, my first name is %s, and I live in %s, and that %s is just a placeholder for a string. Now I'm going to let Python know that I want to replace those statements with a variable, because I mean, look what happens right here. If I were to close this right here and just hit enter, it just prints those %s's as part of the string. I'm going to copy and paste this, send it back. Rather than end my string right here, I'm going to add that %. That lets Python know, hey, those two %s's are placeholders. They're not to be considered part of the string. And now I have to let Python know what variables I want. Now in this case, I have two variables that I have to account for. So I'm going to use a set of parentheses. I'm going to say the first one is name and the second one is location. Now what we're creating right there is a tuple. We haven't talked about the tuple data type yet. So for right now, just know if you have more than one variable that you want accounted for in your string, you're going to go ahead and put those in parentheses. I'm going to add a second parentheses so that my entire print statement is closed. When I hit enter here, I see my first name is Steve, and I live in Arizona. That's a simple way to do string formatting. All right, so we're going to go ahead and clear our screen here, and we're going to look at two other formatting codes that are common. %d, which tells Python to have a placeholder for an integer, and %f, which is the placeholder for a float. Now, to be honest with you, when I do some of the programming of the smaller video games that I write, I find that I do use the %s command most often. 90% of what I use is the string format, and I use floats occasionally. I haven't really found a significant use for me for using %d. But here goes. We're going to name an adventurer, and I'm going to create a variable called adventurer, and we're going to give that adventurer a name. That adventurer is going to be named, well, we'll call her Raven with a Y. That seems like a good name for an adventurer. And we're going to give her health points. So we're going to say health is equal to the number 100. So Raven as an adventurer has 100 health. And I want to print that message to my user. I'm going to, just like I did previously, I'm going to say print %s currently has %d health points. And that string, throw the formatting symbol out there, that %, and say the first placeholder, %s, is a placeholder for adventurer. And the second placeholder, %d, is a placeholder for an integer, health. And when I close that, it prints Raven currently has 100 health points. So let's say Raven gets into a battle with an ogre or a goblin or some big nasty creature, and her health ends up taking a 33-point hit. Health is now equal to 67, and when I run this line of code again, it's printing out the message that Raven currently has 67 health points. Every time I run that piece of code, it's going to look at the adventurer name and put that in the placeholder, and it's going to look at the current health, the variable health, and print that message out. So %d is just a placeholder for a number. Now, what we might want to do is create a inventory, and this will represent the weight of Raven's inventory, and currently she's carrying 7.14 pounds worth of gear. If I create a print statement for that, print %, %s currently has %f pounds of equipment. Adventurer is going to be the first placeholder, and inventory is the second. Now what's going to happen is it's going to print out Raven currently has 17.140000 pounds of equipment. That's because the float placeholder always instructs Python to use 6 decimal places. I don't necessarily want to do that. Now, one way around this would be to change what I'm asking Python to display from a float to an integer. By making that a small change, Python is seeing the inventory placeholder as an integer, not as a float, and it's just going to truncate all of the decimal numbers. Raven currently has 7 pounds of equipment. I may want to keep that as a float value, but I might not want it to go to 6 decimal points. There's an easy way to do that as well. If I do print, %s currently has %.2.5. That command tells Python we want a float there, but we only want 2 decimal places of numbers. Pounds of equipment. And we're going to have adventurer be the first placeholder and inventory be the second. And now Raven currently has 7.14 pounds of equipment on her. And I can limit that even further if I wanted to print Raven currently has, and I wanted to go to 1 decimal point, I simply change that to 0.1f pounds of equipment. That tells Python that we're using a float value there, but we only want to go to 1 decimal point. And the message that prints out, Raven currently has 7.1 pounds of equipment. Okay, so hang with me because we are almost done here. I just want to head on over to the programming window here on the right. I've already created my test.py program, and I want to show you some of the nuances to using the float data type in your programs. The things that I find really helpful and useful in the programs that I write. So let's say I'm going to have a program in which the user enters a weight. And that's going to be an input statement. And it's going to tell the user to enter the weight of your equipment. I'm going to use my escape sequence. And I'm going to store that variable, or I'm going to store the user's input in the variable weight. And then I'm just going to print out, you are carrying %s pounds of equipment. Okay, very simple. Now, before I close this print statement, I need to let Python know what the %s refers to. And I'm going to tell it that it refers to the value contained in weight. So, very simple program here. We're going to run it and see how it works. And over on the left, it says enter the weight of your equipment, and I'm going to say I'm carrying 5 pounds. And as we would expect, it says you are carrying 5 pounds of equipment. If I were to run this program again and test it with a decimal number, let's say I'm carrying 5.5 pounds of equipment, it prints that. I'm going to run it a third time with 5.25 pounds of equipment, and it's not magic. It's a very simple program. Whatever I type in gets printed. In fact, because we're handling weight as a string, I can enter any number I want, or characters. Python is simply going to print whatever it is that I type. Now, in later lessons, we'll look at how to limit what the users can input so they can't do something silly like I just did right there, adding numbers and characters and nonsensical information. Now let's change this to a float variable. When I do that, I'm going to cause an error in this program, because if I enter 5.25 pounds, I'm going to get a type error, a float is required. That's because Python is looking for a float here, and it's getting a string. And we haven't done this yet, but we would need to convert weight to a float. One way to do that is simply say after weight has been inputted and has a value, I want weight to equal the float equivalent of weight. So at this point, weight comes in as a string, and we're telling Python that the information that's contained in this string we want converted to a float and then assigned back to the variable weight. When I execute that program, see, it's working perfectly fine, and I'm getting 6 decimal places in total because the default for Python is 6 decimal places. Now I want to show you one quick trick that might help your code become a little bit more efficient. I don't need 2 lines to accomplish this. Rather, I can convert it right up here. I can take this entire input statement, and that entire input statement is equal to, in the last example, 5.25. I can convert it to a float immediately because Python is going to start from the innermost parentheses and work their way out. So the first thing that happens is it encounters an input statement and says, okay, I'm going to prompt the user to enter a weight. We enter 5.25. We then take 5.25, so that entire highlighted gray area is equal to the string of 5.25, and now we're going to convert it to a float of 5.25 and store that value in weight. So we're converting it to a float immediately. That's going to have a couple benefits for us. First off, when the user goes to input information, if they don't input a float, let's say they enter 1 pound, that's going to cause an error that will prevent the user from typing in something silly. And now in 1 line I've accomplished what I had in 2 lines previously. But back to the main program, you are carrying %f pounds of equipment that equals weight. I want to get rid of all these decimal points. I want to limit it to 2 decimal points. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go to my float placeholder. I'm going to type in 0.2, and that is my instruction to Python. Hey, I only want 2 decimal points. When I run this now, I can enter 5. Oops, keep switching windows and getting errors. I want to enter 5 right here. It says you are carrying 5.00 pounds of equipment. That looks a little bit cleaner, and I'm limiting it with this right here. I can limit it to 1 decimal place by putting in 0.1f. I can run this, say 5 pounds. Now it's limited to 1 decimal point. So that's some of the neat stuff that I can do with this string formatting. But another thing that it does that it's particularly useful for is it automatically rounds numbers. Python does have a built-in function that's the round function that can take numbers and round them to their nearest whole number or to decimals, but this float command will do it inherently. 90% of the time I end up using string formatting, but when I use the float formatting, this is the reason why. So I'm going to round to, let's say, the nearest 10th place. So I'm carrying 5.0, 5.1, 5.2. Let's say I were to enter the weight of my equipment as 5.5 pounds. Down here, that works. You are carrying 5.5 pounds of equipment. If I run this again and I say I am carrying 5.75 pounds of equipment, because I'm rounding up to the nearest 10th place, Python's going to return that as 5.8 pounds. That's because this 5 rounds the 7 up to an 8, and we get 5.8 pounds of equipment. If I were to run, and I'm going to enter 5.1542 pounds of equipment, Python automatically rounds that up to 5.2 pounds of equipment. So there's automatic rounding that goes along with using these float commands that I find to be rather useful. In fact, I can make this look just like a decimal by not a decimal, by an integer by putting 0.0f as my limitation. That tells Python to have no decimal points. When I run this program right here, I can say I'm entering 5 for 5 pounds of equipment, and it formats it, you're carrying 5 pounds of equipment. If I entered, I'm carrying 5.75 pounds of equipment, it will automatically round that up to 6 for me. It's a very useful concept. You'll play around with it a little bit and you'll find what works for you, but in a nutshell, this is how you use the advanced string formatting techniques in your programs. Alright, so let's see what you guys can do. The Lesson 6 challenge program is a simple receipt program. It's going to require you to use the %s string format. It's going to require the float string format, and you're going to have to limit the number of decimal points that print out. So you can see over here on the left, it says enter the item purchased, and let's say I purchased a new computer. Enter the retail price of the computer. It was $999.99. We're going to assume that there's a 9.2% sales tax, and it's going to print off a quick receipt. The computer is $999.99. Sales tax is calculated at $92. And when we add those two things together, the total is $1091.99. If I were to run this program with different items, let's say I wanted to buy a refrigerator. Oh man, I should have picked a word that was easier to spell. I think that's how we spell it. Refrigerator. And the refrigerator is retailing for $749.99. It adds the $69 of sales tax for a total of $818.99. And buy a new pair of shoes. And my shoes are $68.49. Sales tax is calculated at $6.30. Again, I'm using 9.2% as the sales tax amount. You can use any number that you want or any number that makes sense. And the total is $74.79. Your job is to recreate this program right here using the string output that we've discussed during this lesson. Make sure that you're converting the price to a float. So when I entered $749.99 for the refrigerator, my program did convert that to a float, so make sure you're doing that. And when you print it off, make sure you're limiting it to only 2 decimal point characters, since prices don't go to 6 decimal points. If you can write this program right here, you're definitely in good shape. Make sure you're using the concepts from this week. And as always, if you run into any problems, have any questions, have any comments, feel free to leave them in the comments, and I will do my best to answer them as quickly as possible. Best of luck to you. Thanks, and have a great day.